Alan Doss is a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. He was also the former president of the Kofi Annan Foundation, to which he currently serves as senior advisor. Alan has had an illustrious career serving in the United Nations as an international diplomat, leading the UN Development Group, where he also spearheading complex peacekeeping missions in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Congo. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, Alan, I want to just get the ball rolling by putting the following question to you. Economic development is no mean task, and clearly an objective that different countries and governments pursue by different means. So to what extent do you see a functioning sound democracy as a prerequisite for economic development? And could democratization come at the expense of development, if ever?
Yes, that's the key question that keeps coming up because we see a rapid development in a number of countries that aren't yet or don't aspire to be full democracies. So the question is, to what extent is development dependent on democracy, or vice versa? Do we advance democracy through development? I don't think there's a straight line answer to that question. I think this relationship is essentially symbiotic. It takes place, it takes time over time, and one can help the other. It doesn't have to be at the exclusion of the other. And at certain phases, clearly, command style economics works quite quickly if you have to move something forward. And of course, the case that now comes up a lot is China, the example of China in dramatically reducing extreme poverty over the last 30 years. That is a remarkable achievement. So, of course, and China, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on China, but clearly has a top-down approach. On the other hand, we see other countries which have also done quite well, pretty well in reducing poverty, extreme poverty, which means by World Bank standards, I think $2.15 a day to live on, which is, of course, pretty much destitution. But other countries have done well too, like India, Brazil, Mexico, using different approaches and using more who are functioning democracies. But again, democracy is a big word, and it comes in many shapes and sizes, different forms. So I don't think we can apply democracy as a standard across the board, meaning the same thing everywhere. So I think we have to take those two factors into account. And above all, I would say we have to look at both the national as well as the international context in which we are seeing the effort to advance economic development, and in particular, to reduce poverty, extreme poverty in that context. So it isn't one size that fits all.
What I find refreshing about our answer is that we often hear in a lot of mainstream narratives, especially in increasingly bifurcated discussions that we see these days, right? That either there's an assertion that democracy is necessary for development, or there's the assertion that the opposite or the antithesis of democracy, the sort of centralization, authoritarian governance, somehow offers this magical recipe to development. And frankly, I share your view that it's implausible that either of these simplistic narratives could be true, especially not in the case of sort of asserting that authoritarianism is itself sufficient for development. Because at the end of the day, it turns on what kinds of authoritarianism we're talking about here. What about corrupt kleptocracies, totalitarian, states that have no room or little to no room for public participation. So I just find it so refreshing that you take a more balanced approach that's non-ideologically predisposed. And I suppose the question I have is, to what extent does this have to do with your own personal experiences, navigating non-democracies, flawed democracies, as well as authoritarian states as an international diplomat? Did that shape your worldview in a way that I suppose more textbook and orthodox academics just wouldn't be shaped by?
Well, part of it, of course, is living in, and I've lived in across a wide range of countries, including China, where I was for 5 years at the very beginning of China's modernization process. I was there with the UN when we opened the very first aid office in China back in 1979. Spent 5 years there afterwards as part of that effort that was being made then by China and its leaders to modernize the four modernizations and so forth. But I would want to point out that course, this is there's a paradox here, because we see that if you look at the Human Development Index developed by the UN Development Programme, which tries to look at development in a more holistic fashion, not just GDP growth, not economic growth alone, critical though that is to poverty reduction, let there be no misunderstanding there. But it looks at how it looks at education, it looks at life expectancy, and it brings these together to see to what extent there is human progress and not just economic progress, because economic progress, if it's measured in GDP terms, can be very misleading. We've seen lots of countries with high GDP growths where people have not benefited. And I think that is extremely important. And we also know that poverty, there's the absolute extreme poverty level, which China has been very successful, and other countries in reducing. And we have to admire that, and we have to recognize its historic significance for not just for China, but for the world. But at the same time, we see that poverty shifts. And, even though we've reached that minimum threshold, some 50% of the world's population still lives in some condition of poverty. So even though we're a good way to ending extreme poverty worldwide, we're not there yet in terms of the broader picture. Plus, there is one major exception, which of course I'm very familiar with and saddened by, and that is Africa. Because most of the world's poorest people now, those who live on the verge of destitution, are living in Africa. But as I say, there's a large, broad number of people who are not that far from destitution, and it only takes a few black swan events, if I can call them that, for them to fall below the line. But they're living perilously close, and that's a much larger number than the millions, or the several millions, I should say, hundreds of millions, who have already been left, or not left, escaped, rather, absolute poverty. But as I say, it doesn't take much. And the poorest countries, of course, are the most vulnerable, the most susceptible, because they don't control the international economic environment. And of course, many of them are the most subject to violent conflict, which is the greatest destruction of national wealth and well-being.
A very famous study, in a paper actually written by Adam Schrotsky and a number of other co-authors, basically pointed out that above a certain level of GDP per capita, as a sort of the average income, so to speak, per capita, it is unlikely, if not impossible, for democratic rollbacks to occur. So essentially, the argument is that the probability of a decline or demise of democracy approaches zero once we exceed a certain level of GDP per capita. So that was claimed in the article that was provided, I believe, had written around 20 years ago, so to speak. And of course, then from it, they argue that whilst democracy may not have a necessary causal effect on economic development, the opposite might hold true. Although then, is it development? Is it growth? And to what extent does the Human Development Index come into play? That becomes a further question. So there's nevertheless a postulation of at least one direction of the causal relationship. And yet, of course, if we look at what's going on right now around the world, in the EU, we've got Hungary. We've previously had, backsliding in Poland as well, but certainly in Hungary. And in America in 2016, we had the election of a certain individual who is also currently undergoing the judicial system and process. I shall not comment too much on his criminality, but it's clear that there are growing concerns over democracy's viability in high income, fairly advanced and liberal, or named liberal democracies such as America, such as certain European states. So, Alan, are you concerned about the viability of democratic institutions in these long-standing, relatively advanced, developed economies, or do you think we're just exaggerating our fears about the rollback to democracy there?
Well, I think we always need to be as I think Churchill once said, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So we can't take these things lightly. I think what we're seeing in a number of countries is erosion. Well, as various groups like Freedom House and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA, have pointed out, there has been an erosion of democracy. But it's an erosion from a high point we reached, but we're still, I think, a considerably way forward in contrast to where we were in terms of democratic terms before the end of the Cold War. So it's, if you will, the cup half full, half empty. I think there is this serious erosion, including in some of a number of Western liberal democracies where there is concern about an erosion of the elements of democracy, not democracy as a whole, because what is democracy? It's a combination of things. For example, freedom of expression, ability to organize parties, rule of law, most important, judicial impartiality. There we do see elements of the democratic framework being seriously eroded. And that is troubling. That is troubling. We know that we've seen that in other parts of the world, democracy can catch on. Neighbors see other neighbors going in that direction, but the opposite is also true. We can see democracy is very vulnerable, for example, to violence, to the erosion of the rule of law. So I think we have to be very mindful that democracy is always a work in progress. As Kofi Annan always said, democracy is a work in progress, and we cannot be complacent. It has to be fought for every day.
One thought I have when listening to you on that is, and this is just a very tentative hypothesis, so please bear with me as I flesh it out or articulate it. When we think about democracy as an important good and a metric of looking at governments at large, one view, let's just say it's the monistic view, would argue that democracy is the primary metric, the primary yardstick by which we appraise governments in terms of legitimacy, in terms of the justifiability, what makes them good, what makes them sound. But then the opposite view would be one that says, well, actually, there's a pluralist range of different indicators. Democracy is one of them. Stability might be another. Accountability could be related to democracy or could be separate, depending on how we quantify. And it goes back to your question about defining democracy. And then you might also have, to some extent, questions of efficiency, of how sound the policies are, or how much growth and equalization of incomes we end up with. And whilst there might be correlation between these different metrics, Alan, the thought here is that at the end of the day, they come apart. So they don't really gel together in a way that means that once you have democracy, unlock the rest. And once you unlock the rest, you therefore have democracy. It doesn't quite work that way. So I guess the first view is a monistic one, and the second view is a more pluralistic one. And the reason why I think this matters is when we say things like this country is progressing towards democracy, or this country is creeping and shifting away from democracy, it's moving backwards, we're almost implicitly assuming a sort of linearity of progress, right? There's a sort of overarching progression towards more democracy, with democracy as the end goal of evolution. But what do you make of the pluralistic view that maybe, American democracy at its best, French democracy at its best, or American republicanism rather, and then in the case of non-democracies that nevertheless seem to govern and function pretty well. You name China as an example, for instance. You can also name, for instance, Park Chung-hee's Korea, although there were gross human rights violations there. And of course, Suharto's Indonesia again, towards the end of it was a pretty nightmarish situation there again. And even Kagame's Rwanda, you might name these states to be ones where developmentally it's doing well, but in terms of politics and civil liberties, they just aren't democracies. So how should we reconcile this sort of implicit monistic assumption when we talk about democracy with the reality that different types of governments seem to function just as well, although in very different ways, so to speak, in the real world?
Well, I would agree there's no straight line between democracy and development and vice versa. We have to look at the case by case, country by country, taking account of their history, their traditions, their culture, and their present day circumstances. I would say, however, that democracy and development are not inimical. I don't think it's entirely by coincidence that those who do extremely well consistently year after year on these broader measures of development, such as the Human Development Index, are democracies. And as Amartya Sen, the Nobel economics laureate, once said, democracies don't do famines. So you can argue that that's perhaps the extreme end of the scale of dysfunctionality, but nevertheless. But what I think democracy can strengthen development is, of course, through, as you mentioned now, accountability. because accountability is very important. And unfortunately, in poorer countries, the poorest, especially if they're authoritarian or, and worse, ruled by military autocracies, which I think is the worst kind, the poor are the least influential in society generally, everywhere, even in well-advanced democracies. But in those at the other end of the economic scale, they're much worse. Their voice is totally unheard. And I think that is a detriment, obviously, a human rights weakness for people who cannot express their voices freely and openly. Secondly, on the accountability, I think accountability is important because it helps you to correct mistakes. And again, I think in the case of China, we see that this extraordinary progress in terms of basically eradicating extreme poverty. But let's not forget that great mistakes were made in the past, including during the Great Leap Forward, when millions of people died through basically man-made famine.
As well.
Yes, and well, indeed. So I think that's really important to consider that dimension. Plus, as economies become more sophisticated, and I think this is happening to those that enter into what's now being called the middle income trap. Economies have to evolve. They have to become more sophisticated. They have to become more devolved. You cannot run a modern economy every dimension of it from the top. You can set policy guidelines, but when those policies go wrong, democracy's great strength is that there's a voice to say, hey, this isn't working. What can we do it better? And again, we see countries that have gone down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and find it very difficult then to come out because their system doesn't allow for that. Now we know that there are downsides on the other direction, that democracies can be very fractious. It's difficult to get things done. Representative government is that. And depending on whether it's a sort of first past the post system like we have in the UK and the US, or we have a more representative democracy that, the word escapes me for the moment, but where you have the possibilities like in proportional representation, like in Germany and the Netherlands, then you can perhaps bring in the outliers, whereas first past the post tends to intensify polarization, as in fact we've seen, especially now in the United States. So, as I say, we live in this world which has examples of both. But I think over time, the curve bends towards democratic societies because they have built-in self-correction mechanisms. And I think when we weaken those through, tinkering with the rule of law and accountability and impartiality and institutional impartiality, then we begin to see things erode, and that can become corrosive. Corrosion corrodes, and over time it spreads, and this can weaken the institution, the pillars of the state. So I think, but again, no system is perfect, and we recognize democracy has its weaknesses, and it is, as I said, always a work in progress.
What you said about accountability, is fascinating, because whenever I think of accountability, actually, what comes to my mind intuitively is two things. The first is how corporations work, successful ones, so to speak, where there's a degree of accountability of subordinates to the bosses, and where the superiors are the ones holding their sort of juniors accountable. But at the end of the day, the superiors in turn have to report to the shareholders and the board, so to speak. And the second metaphor I think of is the gigantic, sprawling barbarian bureaucracy, where accountability is accomplished through the establishment of institutions, of norms, of checks and balances within said bureaucracy. And yet, very much like Sir Humphrey from Yes Minister, there's no external accountability really to the people. And I'm not saying this to sort of spite bureaucrats, because if anything, I have a lot of respect for them. But it's instead an attempt on my part to segue into, a slightly different angle to the conversation. You've had an incredible career as an international diplomat in the UN. In general, do you think the UN is, in your view, a democratic institution? And to what extent do you see the bureaucracy of the UN as giving away to both strengths and also defects when it comes to accountability and transparency? Because these are obviously the accusations that are levied towards the UN. People complain about it being lacking in accountability, transparency, representation. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, as always, some of that is true, but I would argue most of it isn't correct. But the institution, of course, like all institutionals um, of a intergovernmental nature and even a governmental nature, has flaws. But on the accountability, there is an accountability, but it is of a different kind in the sense that you have a Secretary General who is responsible to the membership, the General Assembly, and of course has to report to the Security Council. And it's a membership-driven organization. People tend to see the UN as just one body, but actually it's a hybrid, if you will. The UN is much more than the Secretary General. Or the Secretariat, of which I was a member for many years. It's the Security Council, and it's the other organs of the UN, which include, the Economic and Social Council. Of course, the Security Council is a pivotal one, because that's where the great issues of the day come. Ideally to be resolved, but too often now, especially in the last few years, not so because of, the UN reflects the world at large, which is becoming more polarized. So ipso facto, the UN is becoming more polarized. But that doesn't mean to say it doesn't have a role to play, and it doesn't mean to say it doesn't have to be accountable to its members. Of course, the big argument is about how accountable is an institution which has five members who can veto everybody else. They can't put through measures when the majority is against them, but it can stop measures with one veto. It's an important distinction there. And of course, it isn't. It doesn't reflect the world of today. It reflects the world of 1945 to some extent, because China was a member in 45, but it wasn't the government of today, of course. So I think it's important to look at the UN as always, like the world at large in evolution. It's time for some changes, and there's great debate now about things surrounding the Security Council. Should its membership be increased? I think it has to, but how do you do that? Because then you run into competing interests of member states. Individual member states. Will Argentina be happy to see Brazil become a member? Will Pakistan want to see India become a member, and so forth? So those are very difficult problems to resolve. And then, of course, whether you want, what sort of representation do you want in the UN, not just at the Security Council? I mean, to what extent should civil society, people at large, voices be heard? Because it was, the Charter talks about we the people, but as has often been remarked, it should have been read we the governments. It's governments and government member states who make the decisions. At the end of the day, it's not the Secretary General. He is a servant of the organization. In fact, the Charter, and I won't bang on about this, refers to him as the Chief Administrative Officer. Yeah. So, and the UN today is very different from it was even when I joined back in the 60s. Although that was a very difficult time for the UN. We forget these things. In the 60s, the UN was paralyzed by the Cold War, which was then in full swing. And one of the countries I subsequently served in a few times, actually twice, the Congo, was at the vortex of that conflict. Was at the vortex because of the intervention where peacekeeping really came into its modern form. So history has a tendency, as we know, if not to repeat itself, as Mark Twain once observed, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Does rhyme. And, you gave me so much food for thought there just then, because you highlighted several really pressing concerns. The first concerning the SC and also the design of the UNSC. The second being the sort of status bias that undergirds its constitutional arrangements, or rather the de facto arrangements of the UN. And the third being, I guess some folks have raised that the challenges of holding a SecGen to accountable during the term for which the SecGen is indeed elected. But I want to really home in on the first point, which is the UNSC. Now, Alan, you've already touched upon some of the proposals that have been raised, expanding the SC to 6 to 7 and bringing African Union, bringing India. But others have suggested abolishing the veto-based system altogether, that we don't have permanent 5, and we don't have nations who would effectively hold hostage the entirety of the UN, whether it be over the current situation in Gaza or previously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whatever manifestations you'd like to point to, these are all examples to suggest that vetoing powers are perhaps given disproportionate sway and influence, and that just is inherently something that we ought to find troubling. I was wondering, what do you make of this proposal? Should we just get rid of the P5 and have, non-permanent members, 15 of them, and that's it?
Yeah. Well, it is true that, again, it's a bit like Orwell's observation in Animal Farm that, all animals are created equal, but some more equal than others. And that's true of the UN. Whether we like it or not, with or without a veto, big states do exercise disproportionate influence in the world. I mean, it's so even if tomorrow you abandon the veto, the 5 permanent members and perhaps a few others, I can think of them, would still exercise disproportionate influence by virtue of their size, their population, their economic clout, and so forth. And that in itself is, we live in a world of nation states. The UN is an association of nation states. The question is, how do we get them to work together for the benefit of themselves, obviously, but also of humankind in general? I think in some respects, especially in its early days, the veto did serve a useful purpose in the sense that it avoided some of the key members from walking out of the UN, which would have destroyed it. We forget the lesson of the League of Nations, of course, is the League was dismembered from within. Members left. Now, that is not to say they were right to leave, because we know that fascism and its manifestations helped to destroy the League. But I just think it's important that we shouldn't think that somehow by abolishing the veto all will be well. That it would make the UN more, quote, democratic, unquote. We live in a world of power reality, and we must attenuate that. We must try and work to achieve through the rules of rules-based order, although that is often more neglected than respected. But nevertheless, I think we have to continue to work towards that end, find solutions. Sometimes the UN will be part of that solution. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll have coalition of interested nations working outside of the UN. And by the way, there's another factor on this that I think is important. It's not well known or understood, that often some of the biggest ideas that have had enormous impact within the UN setting have not started off in the UN. It's very difficult to get a consensus initially within the UN. There's always somebody who's against something. So it's best sometimes to develop ideas and approaches perhaps on the margins of the UN, and then gradually build consensus through regional groups, through pressure by civil society and so forth, to then bring it to maturity and then bring it into the UN. So especially if it comes to the council where you have the veto power. So I think all of these elements are there, and I don't think we should despair. As to transparency and accountability, there are accountability mechanisms. I mean, there's audits and financial issues. One of the big things that has caused a lot of pain for the UN, and I speak of this personally, is these allegations of sexual abuse by peacekeepers. Was deeply, deeply aware that and touched by it, because in missions where I work, this was a critical issue, and so much of what you do, it was so frustrating, can then simply be wiped out because of allegations and more than allegations, let's be honest, of abuse, and that is a huge worry. And there we do need to be very clear, very transparent, very accountable, that this will not be tolerated. And when it occurs, it will be dealt with harshly, directly. But again, the UN is being, again, people don't understand that soldiers, for example, who serve under with blue helmets, are not directly accountable to the UN. They're accountable to their own country. And those include American soldiers, British soldiers, Chinese soldiers, wherever they're from. So the UN can recommend disciplinary procedures, can expel them from a mission, but they cannot put them in prison. That has to be the member states who do that.
I want to home in on a specific question of Congo. which achieved independence in June 1960. And of course, in 1961, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, and this is for those of you listening at home who aren't necessarily familiar with Congo/Zaire's history, with backing from the US and Belgium, overthrew the democratically elected government under Patrice Lumumba, who was nominally backed by the Soviet Union. So this is all part of the Cold War, and it was rather similar, I guess, was pursued subsequently in Latin America in terms of Operation Condor. But in any case, Mobutu then ruled the country for over 35 years, 36 years prior to the two Congo wars in the late 1990s. Now, Alan, your tenure in Congo overlapped with the reignition of civil and ethnic strife, the M23 rebellion, for instance, and tensions between Congo and Rwanda, lots of suspicion, antagonism. What do you think went wrong, after the two Congo wars? Was it the lack of institutions, absence of development, or was it a political failure that led to, the subsequent strife and instability that unfortunately coincided with your tenure there?
Yeah. I'm tempted to say all of the above, because they were all of the above. By the way, let me just mention that I was in the Congo when Mobutu was president of the Congo. I was there as the UN, so-called UN resident coordinator, the senior UN person in the Congo, as well as the representative of the UN Development Program. So I know that I was there when things really began to fall apart, and where he was forced to declare he would give up his political party, would no longer have the monopoly of power. But it was all downhill after that. One of the things we surely have learned over the decades is that when an autocratic, authoritarian, or dictatorial regime falls, it is highly unlikely that there will be a smooth progression to a democratic society. Sadly, it doesn't happen, and the Congo is a prime example of that. The wars that have erupted have caused enormous damage, but it was, if you will, the sequel to those years of misrule, which, by the way, again, was to some extent condoned by Western powers who had business interests, by Western business interests, and then subsequently, quite frankly, by other major powers who were not willing to say to Kabila and his father, who was assassinated, as you know, no, we will not support this. So geopolitical interests, commercial interests, mining interests, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, all Western and other countries have been involved in very dubious deals with in the Congo. I mean, scandalous deals, frankly, which have been pointed out by numerous organizations. The war has continued because the political settlement that broke an end to that the Second Congo War did not solve a number of problems. It has not solved the problem of the political economy of the Eastern Congo, and that is closely linked to ethnicity, to the fallout, the continuing sequel to the genocide in Rwanda, to problems with Uganda and neighboring states. So it's a very complex problem with many threads to it. It's not a single reason. The peacekeepers were tasked when I was there and subsequently to protect civilians, which is a huge job in a country of that size, with no infrastructure, with many competing interests, including particularly now and then as now the Eastern Congo, where neighboring states have become involved. It's been documented by successive UN expert bodies in the trafficking of minerals and of timber and trade and other things. It's a pretty awful. And it's in good part because the Congolese state still is very weak. We're talking about so-called undergoverned spaces. And we've looked for quick military solutions to the protection of civilians and so forth, but we have still not have found answers, which lie in finding political solutions. You can't protect civilians against their own government and their own security forces. It's very difficult to do so. You can do so in small areas over a certain amount of time. So it's a huge issue. And I think the continuing conflict between the DRC and its neighbors, and in particular Rwanda, isn't helping matters. That's not new either. It flared up very badly when I was there. I was involved in trying to find solutions to that problem. So I think there's a mix here, and we have to look for peacekeeping is not the answer. It's a partial solution, but it's not the answer, definitive answer to the breakdown of political society and the usurping of the political economy. And both have happened in the Congo. I find it, and frankly, in those 60 years plus since the Congo became independent, frankly, nobody comes out of it looking too well. Western other powers have meddled in the affairs of Congo, have tried to make money in the Congo. So I'm not saying a plague on everybody's house, but nevertheless, I think there's a lot of blame to share around. And I don't excuse the UN. I mean, sometimes we have not done, and I take first personal responsibility. We didn't get it right always, and we didn't do the right things, made wrong decisions, no doubt about that. So I don't think anybody of this comes out of particularly particularly smelling terribly well.
One element that you highlighted just then, Alan, is the role played by sort of Western powers and forces. And of course, there's a word that we haven't said in our conversation thus far, that I suspect, some folks listening in would want us to say, which is the effects, the corrosive effects of colonialism and the institutions left by colonial governments that have often been used, whether it be in terms of the laws, the juridico-discursive apparatus and instruments, or surveillance and secret police. I mean, a lot of these post-independence authoritarian states in Africa, from Zimbabwe through to in this case Zaire and Congo, and of course a basket of other states in what is now ECOWAS. I mean, all of these, barring perhaps the exception of Ghana, really, they've largely succumbed to extreme cases of authoritarianism, sustained and propped up by largely colonial era laws, so to speak. And when we look at Congo, Joseph Kabila was in power, or he placed himself in renewed terms. I think for over 19 years he ruled the country after his father's very tragic death. And as you said, no one comes out of this clean, is even though his father was a victim of political terrorism and violence. Well, in the case of Joseph Kabila, he was also himself an autocrat. So my question for you is, rolling back the dial to, I guess, the second time you're in Congo, what would you have done differently, and what could you have done differently? And I guess these two questions aren't necessarily going to yield the same answers.
Right. On the first part about the colonial inheritance, if you will, or legacy, perhaps, what you say is very true. I mean, much of the Congo's problems stem from the structure of the state as was set up during the regnum of Leopold, and then during the Congo Free State, which followed it. And sadly, during those years of imperialism and colonialism, not just in the Congo, let's be frank and honest, this was common to a number of other colonies or imperial possessions. Clearly, the well-being of local people was not of primary concern. There was a great deal of exploitation, economic and social, in those countries, which was documented at the time by Western leaders, writers, and so forth. I mean, who denounced this, but it was true also in other colonies, and some have managed to, if you will, escape the shadow of colonialism, but not escape, but have managed to overcome it. I don't think you will ever escape, because that will be there. But equally well, I think now, it's almost, most of them, these countries, the African countries, were gained independence in 1960, 61. So we're talking now 70 years plus, and they've made their own mistakes. I don't think everything can be totally blamed on the past. The past casts a long shadow. History casts a very long shadow. I agree with you on that. But equally well, their own mistakes, and I think this is part of that point of political evolution. And today, many African states are struggling with how to deal with their recent past. And democracy, I was in West Africa quite a lot, and there was a period over the last after 1990, especially in the early 2000s, when many of the West African countries, with the support and guidance of ECOWAS, had made considerable progress on the democratic front. Reasonably free and fair elections that were recognized as such. But that has rolled back now, sadly, really sadly, and we have to ask why. And part of that is the economic crisis that has overwhelmed them, as well as, of course, the jihadist encroachment in much of Sahelian West Africa, all of Sahelian West Africa, frankly. And this has led to a return of military rule. Democracy, in part, has disappointed. It hasn't delivered, especially for young people. And it's partly because I think we may have oversold democracy. Democracy is not a panacea for development. It can help pave the way, as we've just discussed earlier on, but it's not a panacea. And we see now young people have become disillusioned with democracy. And some African leaders, I remember a conference with former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, warned about that at Chatham House in London, said, look, we have to be very aware that democracy is failing us. And I think that needs some soul searching. And we have to really think about what is it that how can we, but at the end of the day, democracy can't be imported. That's what I want to say. It has to be a local construct. Local people have to believe in it, want it, and build it. We can't impose that from outside, nor should we seek to do so.
What you said about countries needing to take responsibility for their own fates, and also the fact that we can't attribute everything and all in terms of the Malays' experience to colonialism, resonates with me in the case study of Myanmar. We think about what happened. A few years ago, I spoke with Charles Petrie, a former colleague of yours, I believe, who was the UNDP Perm Rep in Myanmar.
Right.
These are obviously very challenging times in the country. I think we spoke, Charles and I, around 3 to 4 months after the coup by the Tamador. And if we look at Myanmar right now, the junta government is clearly struggling to hold on to power. And in many ways, it's almost reminiscent of the immediate run-up to the AAA uprising, that overthrew General Ne Win. Except in this case, I guess the junta is faced with a far more fragmented and splintered opposition with involvement of foreign forces from all over the world. So it's not just Myanmar itself, but also, many of these ethnic militias, the opposition, or the government and the military could well be acting as proxies and representatives of other forces beyond the borders of Myanmar, so to speak. So I guess the question I want to ask you before we turn to wrapping up our wonderful discussion on UN and also these case studies is, do you see a viable path forward for democracy in Myanmar? Do you see a viable future for the country that is currently enduring unprecedented, or rather unprecedented in recent years and decades at least, repression on the ground?
Well, the word you use there, unprecedented, is very important because it isn't unprecedented. This does indeed link to our earlier conversation about the legacy of colonialism and empire, because Myanmar, of course, is a prime example of where divide and rule was practiced with, Burma, as it was absorbed into the Indian Raj. And became an outpost of the Indian Raj as part of the British Empire. And to control the country, the British administrations and to make the most of its extraordinary wealth. It's hard to believe this today, but at its peak, Burma was the largest exporter and producer of rice in the world. A long time ago now, but so divide and rule. So the British administrators favored different groups as a way of diluting the power of the Burma, the Burmese, the Plains Burma, people of the Burma, who were really the majority of the population. So, and they set about doing that using different administrative means. which tended to encourage the fragmentation. So there was special treatment for ethnic groups and different parts of the country and so forth. Add to the fact that they did indeed help bring migrants from what is today Bangladesh to work on the rice harvest and so forth. But that does not excuse in any way what has happened to the Ranger population. I want to make that very clear. I was deeply involved with Mr. Annan in trying to find solutions to the issues, which we did propose at least, which were accepted by Aung San Suu Kyi at the time. Although I know what happened afterwards with the military repression, which regrettably she tried to defend in The Hague. So there have been mistakes again all around. But Myanmar is a case where there is, it's called the Union of Burma, but it's a union without unity. And it's never had unity, because what happened was, I mean, I don't want to go into a detailed history of Myanmar and Burma, but from the very beginning, the army was seen and positioned itself as being the one force that could unite these Fisipari tendencies, and used its force to do that, and claimed the mantle of being the protector of the nation because it alone could keep everybody together. But what happened there has happened in other countries where you see the military take over, is that you end up with a military state within a state. And that military group becomes self-perpetuating. And it's happened in other countries too. And the result is that you have a bifurcated governance structure, which was the case in Myanmar. And when the military don't like something, of course, then, as we're now seeing in other countries like Pakistan, they then turn against the civilian authority. I'm sure I shall get a lot of protest from Pakistan on that remark, but anyway. And it's not, we've seen this time and again. And when military autocracies take over, they've generally been, frankly, especially on the economic front, a disaster. Look at what happened in Latin America, where at one stage, almost all of the countries were run by military autocracies. Today, fortunately, none are. And you see the important strides that they've made in economic and social terms. So I think Myanmar is, where will it go? I think so much depends now on the, first the conflict, the violence. You cannot have a constructive dialogue while the violence continues in the way it is. And we do not know what will happen now, because the Amartya seems to be on the back foot. So I think we have to try to get through the violence and stop the violence, and then see what sort of national construct that the people of Myanmar, Burma, want. Because we can't impose and shouldn't seek to impose. I think outsiders, big states, particularly its neighbors like India and China, can exercise influence, but at the end of the day, it has to be the people of Myanmar who decide what sort of state they want, that can be inclusive, that can respect tradition, but is also recognizes that that everybody must be a part of it, and one part of the state cannot predominate over another part of the state. That's a huge task. I don't think there's any immediate solutions. This is going to take time, but sadly, much bloodshed is being spilt now, and the prospect is of more. But I see this really as a huge challenge, above all for the people of Myanmar.
I don't mean to defend anybody and anyone in particular, although a question that has often cropped up in my mind is just when it comes to Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and the amount of agency she really had. I mean, Daw Aung San would plausibly plead that in her case, she was trying very hard to keep democratic institutions intact while staving off the encroachment by the Tamil, and obviously with reserve quotas in the legislature, and also with the ongoing strife that admittedly was largely contained almost and subdued thanks to, post 2015. There was this real sense of hope and optimism that I saw and heard from my friends in Myanmar. They tell me the economy is actually revving up again. The engine is there. Folks are coming in. There's FDI, the Japanese, the Thai. There was a real sense of optimism. So I guess, from the point of view of Aung San Suu Kyi, it was almost like an attempt on her part to defend and hold together a very fragile coalition, or a coalition of the willing, so to speak, in relation to the economy. But on that note, Alan, an interesting thought that I have, and an interesting question that I have, concerns Now, the question I have for you, without intending to defend Aung San Suu Kyi or anything, was that her hands were plausibly tied in many ways by the Thermidor. She could argue that whether it be the reserve quotas in the legislature or the in the insidious and persisting influences in their presence throughout Myanmar's politics, it was very hard for her to resist some of the initiatives and pressures from the Thermidor. So I suppose the last question on Myanmar I have for you is, what exactly could she have done differently to prevent the democratic rollback and the coup that occurred, in so unfortunately a couple of years ago?
Well, the sad thing is, or tragic actually, is that despite her, pleading on behalf basically of the Tatmadaw, it didn't make any difference. They still organized the coup because I think they saw her success in the elections, that the writing was on the wall. And I'm just speculating now. I wasn't there when it happened, but it seemed to me that they realized that she would now have the political authority to move to adjust the constitution and to basically put in place a truly representative civilian government, which would have reduced greatly the power of the Tatmadaw. So, unfortunately, if that was the calculation, and I can't obviously peer into the mind of somebody as complex as Aung San Suu Kyi, it just didn't. It may have backfired, put it that way, and which is, as I say, immensely tragic because she has done, huge service. Nobody can understand the sacrifices she made at a personal level to bring back democracy bring democracy to Myanmar. So I think, as I say, I think she should, of course, be freed from confinement. What kind of confinement is not exactly clear at the moment, as soon as possible. I mean, whatever may have happened, that doesn't justify her being, evicted from office and then imprisoned. She was the elected representative of the people. That's what they want. So I think now whether we can go back to where we were, I'm not sure. This is the problem. When that cord is broken, it's very difficult to rejoin it. And even if you can, there'll always be a knot there. But for the sake of Myanmar and its people, long-suffering people, I might add, I hope that there will be eventually a compromise and a consensus as the way to forward to I don't say restore constitutional rule, because the previous constitutional rule was rather one-sided in favor of the military, but to find and to somehow find a way to persuade the military that they have to be part of the new society, but not at all the same part that they played before. And that is always a great challenge when you're moving from any authoritarian, autocratic, or military rule to a civilian one. I mean, it's a dilemma that many countries have faced, including, for example, Indonesia, which moved from autocratic military rule into a civilian rule, and of course has now seen a general elected as president. So it is possible, and let's hope that that can happen to Myanmar. And I can't obviously prescribe the shape of what that may take in terms of a constitution, but I think clearly the situation is getting worse, and the longer this persists, the more difficult it will be, obviously, to bring together the country again into a genuine union, whether it's whatever shape that new constitutional arrangement makes. And constitutions come and constitutions go, at least in their written form. So let us hope that the bloodshed can come to an end. But as somebody once remarked, hope is not a strategy. I think there'll be a need for various influence people, or groups, countries, people with influence, to try to bring the elements together to find a way forward.
As it stands, it strikes me that, what's going on in the minds of Min Aung Hlaing, the current leader of the junta. It's up to it's anyone's guess really. But at the same time, one thing is clear, that the fragmentation and fracturing of the elite appears to be a precipitously preeminent trend that we see. And I don't want to dwell too much on this very tragic situation, but if there's a broader question I want to raise as we come to the end of this conversation, Alan, it's about how we ought to engage with non-democracies, because whether it be the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or alternatively the persistence of authoritarian regimes in Afghanistan and Myanmar, we're looking at really the divides between different regimes and also countries, not just along the lines of democracies versus autocracies, because that's far too simplistic, but instead it strikes me that, we've got a Sino-American rivalry brewing in the background. America's aligned with plenty of non-democracies today, and China is working with and economically collaborating with very large democracies like Indonesia, for instance. It's really not that simple in terms of the so-called purported divide we're trying to shoehorn everything through the lenses of. But my question is, what can we do to ensure that authoritarian regimes, on one hand, may be brought to become more liberal, more reformist, more pragmatic to some extent, and yet on the other hand, we would not repeat the same mistakes of attempting to instigate regime change, whether it be directly or inadvertently, that we've seen so many times over the past few decades, attempts to change governments from outside, attempts to impose governments from the outside. Now, how can we walk the fine line between being excessively accommodationist on one hand versus being excessively interventionist on the other, qua democratic and free world, quote unquote, so to speak?
Well, I think the first point is you're right that interventions to replace governments by forceful means have often backfired. I think much depends on the case. Is that authoritarian government there with some measure of popular support, even if it is a repressive government, but for other reasons, it may enjoy some measure of national support. Is it a danger to its neighbors, which is another factor that we have to take into account if it's an expansionist power of some kind? What I think we want to avoid is, if possible, is turning these conflicts into proxy wars, because those are much more difficult to handle. And they only end often because there is, sometimes in a totally unforeseeable way, an alignment of interests. This is how the war in Cambodia was brought to an end, if you recall. For 10 years, the war went on and there were numerous peace initiatives. But finally, events happened outside, actually, of Cambodia. Change in Russia, changes in China, and indeed in interests in Thailand and Vietnam. This alignment of interests that suddenly, not suddenly, but appeared, that opened a window to peace. And I think we have to be ready for that. I think there's a limit to what you can do, even the most powerful states, to change the internal dynamics. But I think what we have to do is watch, be careful, try to avoid turning conflicts into proxy wars, like is what's happened in Syria, for example, and because those are terribly devastating. And find and wait and try to align those interests so that peace will return, and with it, one hopes the prospects for sound governments. Initially, obviously, it's the violence that is the concern, the bloodshed, the destruction, things we're now seeing, not just in Myanmar, we're seeing and also I think we need to make a distinction that's very important between wars between states, which were the dominant concern in centuries past, and wars within states. And what we've seen, especially in the last 30, 40 years, has been wars within states. In a way, Myanmar is a war within a state, as are many of the African conflicts today in, for example, Sudan and so forth. But sometimes war within states become wars between states because of proxy interests. When wars within states become wars between states, they're much, much more, or conflicts, I should say, they become violent conflicts. They become much more difficult to resolve, and they drag on, and because each party is fueling the other. And we see this now as I say, in places like Sudan. We've seen it in Syria. I worry that might happen in Myanmar, and that would be really truly disastrous. It would just simply prolong the suffering and the destruction. So I think we have to look and see to what extent external powers can exercise positive, constructive influence without making matters worse for their own internal or domestic audiences or interests. And so there is a role. I don't think we can impose from the outside. We should not seek to dislodge governments because we don't like them. I think people have a way of eventually coming around to see that their best interest lies in democratic participation. Inclusive societies are generally, I think it's fair to say, more durable and more pacific. But again, perhaps I'm just being unduly optimistic. But when you work for the UN, you have to be optimistic. You have to believe that things can be better, and you have to work to try to make them better.
Alan, it's been such a privilege to hear from you today, not just on democracy and its relationship with development, but also on your own reflections, from your decades worth of experience in navigating complex quagmires, both within countries and within the UN. It's really been a treat. And I'm sure those of you in the audience, you would also have many questions for Alan, which I believe Alan would love to answer going forward with his wonderful insights, dispensing his wisdom for all of us to learn from. So thank you once again for your time, Alan. And thank you all to those of you tuning in at home. Stay tuned for more OXGS episodes on democracy and development, as well as other topics. Thank you very much.